There's about 1.43 billion people in Africa, right? Which brings the total to about 18% of the global population is actually found in Africa. Some of the world's fastest growing economies are found in Africa. About a fifth of the Earth's area, right, is covered by the landmass of Africa, right? Now, in April of 2024, the IMF released a report stating that Africa's GDP sits at about 2.8 trillion US dollars, right? Which is comparable to the GDP of UK. I think the GDP of UK sits at about 2.67 trillion US dollars. And you can also compare it to the GDP of France, right? Which actually sits at about 2.63 trillion US dollars. So you would say that in terms of GDP, Africa is the size of France or the UK. Now, in terms of the main driving economies of this GDP in Africa, about half of the GDP that you find in Africa is basically driven by about five economies, right? So it's about 1.4 trillion US dollars is generated in terms of GDP by five countries in Africa. The first country that is the main contributor to the GDP in Africa, the size of the GDP in Africa, is South Africa, right? South Africa is responsible for about 373 billion US dollars worth of GDP in Africa. Now, the second country which contributes to about half of the GDP in Africa, right, is Egypt. Egypt's GDP sits at about 347 billion US dollars in terms of GDP contribution to the total GDP of Africa. Now, number three on the list is Algeria, right? Algeria contributes about, or the size of the GDP of Algeria is about 266 billion US dollars, right? Which actually places it at position three of the main contributors to about half of the GDP of Africa. Now, the fourth biggest contributor in terms of African GDP is Nigeria, right? Nigeria sits with a GDP of about 252 billion US dollars. That actually contributes to about the total GDP of Africa. And the fifth main contributor to Africa's GDP is Ethiopia, right? Ethiopia is about the size of the GDP that Ethiopia contributes is about 205 billion US dollars, right? So, in total, right, these five countries contribute about 1.4 trillion US dollars in terms of GDP in Africa, which is exactly half of the GDP of Africa, right? And the rest, it's the rest of the countries that you find in Africa. Now, when we zoom into these five countries and actually look at what exactly contributes to this big GDPs, right? When we take a look at South Africa, there are, I would say, three main contributors, right? The first major contributor is the finance industry, right? The second main contributor is the manufacturing industry, and the third main contributor in the GDP of South Africa is mining, but to be particular, it's gold and platinum group metals. Now, when we focus on Egypt, right, the main contributor to Egypt's GDP is them controlling the Suez Canal, right? The Suez Canal, um, basically about 12% of global trade passes through the Suez Canal, right? And Egypt actually controls that and what can I say, tolls ships that actually are passing there, and they need to pay a certain amount to access the Suez Canal, right? Another contributor in the Egyptian economy is the tourism, right? The pyramids are a main contributor that helps Egypt to be a quite a prominent GDP economy in Africa. Now, the third country is Algeria. The main source of GDP in Algeria is, I would say, it is natural gas. They contribute a lot in terms of natural gas, and the main contributor to their GDP is natural gas. Now, when we look at Nigeria, right? Nigeria is, I would say it's similar to Algeria, right? As I mentioned, Algeria, it's natural gas, the production and export of natural gas. But in terms of Nigeria, it is crude oil, the production and export of crude oil from Nigeria. Now, lastly, when we look at the main contributor to Ethiopia's GDP, it's mainly agriculture, right? Ethiopia is the fifth biggest exporter of coffee in the world, right? So their main source of GDP, right, is agricultural products. Now, it is further reported that by the end of 2024, the GDP of Africa will be around 3.1 to about 3.3 trillion US dollars. So it's set to grow to 3.1 or to about 3.3 trillion US dollars by the end of 2024.